give the people now. Give people what they want. Well. Don't you know you got to give the people what they want.
Hello, welcome. I'm Conor Henderson. I'm currently an assistant professor of marketing at University of Oregon, teaching marketing strategy. So I designed this presentation for my marketing strategy students who want to learn how to use the marketing engineering software to run a segmentation analysis, and it'll help them with their homework. So that's the motivation. I also hope this will help anyone interested in adding some analytical tools to aid them in segmentation, targeting, positioning, the process. Hopefully they'll find this presentation valuable. Students of Rob Palmatier and Oliver Rust at UW, they'll probably be able to use this for their homework assignments, but they're doing the exact same homework assignment using marketing engineering as well. So hopefully this will be an effective aid for you if you're one of those students. Okay, let's begin. I'll start with the agenda. So first things first, I'm going to try to describe overall how marketing engineering helps segment the market, placing it inside the overall process of segmentation. And then I designed an example application that uses marketing engineering for Excel to solve a particular problem. The example I designed a few years ago, basically about when Seattle's NBA team, the Supersonics, they left Seattle, became the Oklahoma City Thunder, and I created an example of how I could use segmentation to identify season ticket holders who would be most likely to help form a coalition that would bring back an NBA team to Seattle. So a non-traditional example, but it fits nicely with the homework assignment. I think it's kind of fun that it's not just how do we sell more, it actually shows you, hey, there's lots of cool problems where you want to understand that people are different. Let's focus on those that are similar and likely to understand our value proposition. We have a nice product market fit, and then structure our messaging and everything we do to really emphasize that we're helping solve one of their needs. We're providing them some value. At the end, I'm going to talk about the homework assignment, the segmentation case that relies on the marketing engineering for Excel software. I'm not going to do a demonstration of the homework, but I'm going to basically provide a nice overview and emphasize what you need to think about as you go forward, not just with the analysis, but especially taking this as a tool that you can use moving forward in a variety of situations. So before we talk about the software, let's talk about the segmentation process. First thing you want to do is identify the pool of customer needs and descriptors that you could collect data on and use for an analysis. And what you're going to end up doing, and I'll show you this with the software, is in focusing on customers' needs, you want to get data on all the different reasons why customers would want to buy what you're offering, or why they would care about what you're trying to deliver, what the value you want to deliver. And then descriptors identify customers, and what you're hoping for is that a particular group of customers who are very similar and are interested in the same value proposition are also easy to identify with some easily obtainable descriptive information. And then using that, you can try to predict which customer you come across would be in your target segment. And you'd also be able to do a better job of going forth and identifying them and then actually reaching them through your messaging and communications, and then tailoring your proposition and your messaging to really emphasize what they care about. And the key to this is doing good qualitative research, kind of understanding up front who are all the customers out there and how can I reach them. And ideally you're going to be doing focus groups with customers, structured and unstructured interviews with customers, and you could even hire consultants that all they do is qualitative research, and they could really go through a whole bunch of reasons you probably never thought of about why customers initially buy and the buying process and what's going through their minds from their initial search to their final decision, also through their consumption and the whole consumption cycle when they move on to the next product upgrade, or when they get rid of the product, and how they would talk about it in terms of word of mouth. Tons of stuff you can just learn about when you try to empathize and understand all the different customers out there. The problem is sometimes you're in a time crunch. If you're doing a class assignment where you want to do segmentation and come up with a targeting plan that focuses on a particular segment, you might not have time to do qualitative research and collect data and do the analysis. And so what I recommend employees or team members doing one of these exercises, pretend qualitative research. One thing that can work pretty well is have different members of your team, different employees, managers, pretend to be a different type of customer. And actually, almost like acting in an acting class, do some improv, have a role, have a customer in mind, and do a focus group with people pretending to be different types of customers. It can be funny, but also stimulate their creativity. If you're, a 30-year-old manager and you're pretending to be a 70-year-old evaluating golf carts and talking about how you use golf carts and what you would love about a better golf cart, and talking to another manager who's 30 but pretending to be a teenager who goes golfing with his friends. Obviously they'd have different needs, and if your team, your employees are all kind of similar, you kind of have to put on that mindset, put on that hat as if you were these different types of customers to try to think of all the factors out there that would influence why they buy and how they use certain offerings. So if you do good qualitative research, then you'll be better able to collect data from a random assortment of potential customers. And the key here is, the sample. It shouldn't just be your existing customers, right? You could do a segmentation only on your existing customers, and that would tell you about the different customers that you serve, and you could gain some insights. But the initial step is to segment the whole entire market and really focus on customers that you can really win, make a lot of money off. And so as you go about collecting data, think about any inclusion criteria and the biases that come with it if you don't have a representative sample. So the key here is to kind of work extra hard to get those respondents who are more difficult to get insight from. You got to be careful with incentives. Let's say you do a drawing for people that take your survey and you're going to give out $200 gift card. Well, everyone likes money, but where the gift card can be used, if it's Nordstrom versus Best Buy, you might have a certain type of customer more likely to be interested in it and take the survey. Or if it's a $100 card versus a $50 card, that could influence who would really be motivated to take your survey. One great thing I often recommend is if you can give away your own product, that can raise awareness for what you're currently selling, but doing that could also bias your sample in terms of not only who's most likely to respond, but also they're going to have characteristics and values of what your product delivers in mind as they take your survey. So use a variety of different incentives if you're going to use incentives. Try to get customers from a variety of different methods and keep track of how representative they are to any existing data you have. So take advantage of your existing data. You can merge in any existing data if you're a web-based company, obviously with all the Google Analytics of clicks and purchases. You want to make sure that it matches any available information that you currently have in terms of your sample's characteristics. And then you want to include questions that are going to help you judge segments' attractiveness. So these might be descriptors, but in terms of size, their spending, their growth, kind of anything that projects into the future, where they currently shop, what other type of products that are complements or substitutes do they buy. If you're doing kind of a big survey, you can also include information on their perceptions of you and of your competitors. Include a segmentation and positioning analysis from one survey. You want to include questions that are both perceptual and preferences if you want to do a positioning analysis. In the Markstrat world, if you're familiar with that, you're one of my students, you know that you can look at a map, a multi-dimensional map, and you can see what customers prefer in terms of attributes. You can also see their preferences for different brands, and you can see how they perceive different brands on several attributes. And that's not part of what we're going to cover today in terms of segmentation, but it really aids to positioning, and you can create a positioning map using that information. So if you are able to collect a pretty thorough survey, then you might want to include questions on how brands are perceived, both yours and your competitors, and what preferences are. And if you get that information, there's a separate analysis under marketing engineering that you can use. Another key here is point E, especially when you're thinking about what descriptors to try to get information on, anything that's easily obtainable about customers. You want to include questions to address implementation. So anything around the 4 Ps, how much they currently spend for certain categories, their price sensitivity in general, where they shop, their shopping habits, placement, if they're an online shopper, if they shop at a mall, or in business-to-business settings, what's their buyer group? Is it a large company, a small company? Do they go to trade shows and conferences? Anything you know about different companies' buying process in terms of taking orders and competitive bids? All that type of information might correlate with a particular segment, which would be great because it'd help you identify your target segment, and it also might inform how you go to market. So it can be a win-win there. So you want to know the media habits of your customers. If it's a business to business, maybe it's about LinkedIn, it's more of a consumer. Are they on YouTube? Are they on social media, Pinterest, Twitter, Facebook, Google? Do they, use Google AdWords? Do they click on those? Do they do web searches for your category? If they do, you might say, hey, Google AdWords would work for our target segment. So if you can understand kind of how they go about their general shopping experience and shopping in particular to what you have to offer, then you tailor your go-to-market strategy to fit with the segment that you want to go after. Okay, if you have a data set, it's going to be grouped into kind of 2 pages, and you'll see that. You'll have one page that basically has all the need-based information on your customers. So you'll have a list of customers and their input on what's important to them, what are their needs, and how they rate the importance of needs. And you'll use those needs to segment the market, to describe the total set of customers as consisting of small, homogeneous groups. A general rule of thumb, start out with 3 to 5 groups. If you're doing the first segmentation of a set of customers of a particular market, it usually is best to use 3 to 5 groups as the number of segments that will most effectively describe that market. If you're very familiar and you've been doing segmentation and you're just trying to gain that small competitive edge, maybe you keep doing finer and finer and more granular splits of customers, and you could have 10s, 20s of groups of customers that are all slightly different. That might be something you do ongoing if you have a really analytical company. You can put the process into place that every so many months we do a new segmentation. Trying to win based on some nuances, you might need to go to a more fine-grained view of the market. But 3 to 5 groups is a great place to start so that you haven't oversimplified things too much. You're gaining some insights, some subtleties about why customers are different. And the great thing about the software is it can point to kind of how many groups you should use to characterize the market. And the second page you'll see in the Excel dataset is where you store all your descriptor data. So you have all your data on the customers based on things that can be used to identify them, that describe the customers, not based on why they buy, but more just who they are. And the key here is you really want to segment based on reasons why someone buys. That correlates to purchases. Obviously, it's more closely tied to what you care about, and not just kind of things that are identifiable. I like to say in terms of segmentation, do your segmentation. If you break up the market based on descriptor information, you might get accused of being racist or sexist or politicalist or classist or whatever. But if you segment based on needs, you're only going to be accused of being rich and successful and a genius. So there's 2 types of companies, those that segment based on needs and those that are bankrupt, right? Either they don't segment at all or they segment on descriptors. So be the one that segments based on needs, right? Cool. Once you get your output, you're going to try to get some insights from the outputs, and of course you got to be aware of any biases that went into the data generation. Assuming you have a good data set, you're going to want to name the segments and rate them on attractiveness and competitive strength. And so if you have time to get customer input on these dimensions, that's great. But if not, you might say, okay, in terms of attractiveness, what would be the cost to serve? how well could we acquire them right now? How well could we defend that market share in the future? How likely would a particular segment be to not only buy from us today, but rebuy from us in the future, buy our next generation of our product offering? Things like that. And so maybe you have multiple people in your team rate attractiveness. An engineer and a customer service person might be able to rate the cost to serve dimension, and potentially the salespeople would be able to kind of give you some indication on potential revenue that is attached to any group. You might already have an indication of the size of the segment based on the results. Also the growth, projecting that would be valuable. In terms of competitive strength, how you match up to your competitors for what they care about and what you can deliver, that really takes some insight. Ideally, you can get customers to help you understand your competitive strength in terms of your current offerings, your current brand, but you also might want to project out into the future about what you could provide in the future, and you might know your technical capabilities, your ability to recruit employees that would help you deliver what customers want. So, you gotta do some real judgment here in terms of figuring out who you want to target. And then when you know who, you're at step 6, you choose a segment to target and you act accordingly. You position your product offering a little bit differently. Maybe change the price. Maybe you emphasize a certain channel of distribution or a certain way of contacting that customer group. Maybe you do some inbound marketing, some blogging, some content marketing that's aimed at a particular segment. You could add some accessories, services, or update what you have as an offer and how you're going to go to market to really customize it and align everything to best give that set of customers what they want. You got to give them what they want. Got to give them what they need. So that's the overall process. And for your homework assignment, the data has already been collected for you. All you got to do is be aware of what might be missing in terms of questions and in terms of any biases and inclusion criteria. So understand how that data came to be, but you don't actually collect it. You do the analysis, and you do, steps 5 and 6 are really the keys to doing a good job on your homework. All right. What's different between MarkStrat World, which you're all familiar with if you take my class, and marketing engineering? And so MarkStrat World, that's the simulation game. You order research reports to multi-dimensional scale. This map is a 2x2 map of what brands are perceived as and what customers want. This is kind of the output of what you can get from marketing engineering if you collect data correctly. So this has an economy dimension as one need, one thing that customers care about, and a performance dimension. And in this case, they've broken customers up into 5 segments. In MarkStrat, they've already decided there's 5 segments. In marketing engineering, you're going to have to decide. It's going to help you determine how many segments to group customers into. Let's say you were behind this MarkStrat output. You might say, like they did, that there's 5 segments. Obviously, the savers are kind of unique down here by themselves. They really care about economy, not so much about performance. Shoppers is a different segment. What they care about seems to be quite different in terms of on this map. They're out there by themselves. Unfortunately, at this time, no brands are perceived as really giving them what they want. You see Move and Solo down here are close by to what the shoppers want in terms of economy, but they're much lower in terms of how they're perceived on performance. With marketing engineering and the homework assignment we're doing now, we're characterizing what segments want, but we're not doing a good job of saying how brands are perceived. But with marketing engineering, you could do that. It's called a positioning study, and I'll just ask you to look into that on your own. We're not going to have a homework assignment on it. And so if that's what you're interested in, I'd be happy to talk to you outside of this class setting. One thing to point out here is that you see in terms of at least these dimensions of economy and performance, the high earners right here, that's a segment of customers, are very similar to the professional segment. And so you have to decide when you're in the marketing engineering world, is it better to categorize the market space in terms of 5 segments as is done, or should we combine these 2 that seem similar into one segment? And if you're over here competing for those, it might make sense to think of them as different. The professionals want a slightly different price and a little bit more performance. The high earners, they just want the most status, the most expensive brand out there on the marketplace. And so if you're one of these brands, those differences might be worth considering. But if you're focused on the savers or the shoppers, you could kind of just group all these other brands and all these other segments of customers as those that are willing to spend a lot, because the subtle differences don't impact you as much as you're not focused on them. So that's how you got to integrate judgment with the data, and we'll show that more in the example. Okay, moving forward, before we get to the analysis, a big assumption here, and the key point is the software does not care. The software only wants to describe the data based on patterns. It doesn't care if the patterns are good. It doesn't care if the patterns are meaningful. If you have data on a set of customers, businesses, users, patients, if you have data on a set of individual entities, and the software can group customers based on patterns of similarity and dissimilarity. It does not care if the data corresponds to purchases, clicks, or usage, or whatever you care about. And it does not care about what's missing. You have to know that and have judgment and be, thoughtful analyst, not just one who can push the buttons, but who can understand what assumptions are behind this and what risks should I account for when I do my interpretation. And what can I do up front in my data collection? Okay, now is the time for fun. I'm going to give the people what they want. So we're here on the agenda where we get to my example. I'm going to give a little background, and then I'll show you in Excel how to use marketing engineering. Okay, so my example is bring back the Sonics. It's a hypothetical example. It's motivated by when the Sonics departed Seattle for Oklahoma City. And in this case, let's assume I had conducted a short survey for 27 former season ticket holders. So maybe I worked for the Sonics and I was able to get in contact with 27 of the season ticket holders and have them fill out a short survey. With just 27 respondents, I can get some insight. I'm going to show you that. So using the 27 respondents and the marketing engineering software, I merged the survey results with some information I had on all season ticket holders. And I asked them in the survey, what they enjoyed about being a Sonic season ticket holder. So there's several needs. Which ones were important to you? I find the core members. I find out, what they cared about. And I focus in on those with the resources they're willing and able to provide towards my efforts. Then I can use the segmentation results to form my coalition of support. How do I do that? I use all available descriptive information on season ticket holders. So this is information I have on not just the 27 respondents, but on every season ticket holder. And I predict who belongs in my target segment. So I'm predicting segment membership based on the descriptors. And now I have a big list of people who I think fit this core group of members. And I can individually go out and target them with a specific message to say, hey, we can do this. This actually almost happened last year. The Sonics almost came back to Seattle, but they stayed in Sacramento, which is actually my hometown team. Let's get to the data. Alrighty. So here we are. We're in Excel. We're ready to go. First thing to do, anytime you have a data set, you got to get familiar with it before you start your analysis. So look at the top of this data set. We see I added some little words, little notes to myself so I can remember what this sample is comprised of when I come back to the data set. And basically says the sample is of Seattle Supersonic season ticket owners, but specifically those who held at least 4 seats. So when they came to the game, they had at least 4 tickets. These aren't people who only had 2 tickets. And I guess potentially I was focused on people who were pretty significant season ticket holders. Another thing I have a note about is that I asked about reasons for holding season tickets and interest in a new team. And these are reported on a scale from 1 unimportant to 5 important. And so when I look down at my data, I see I have observations, and there's 27 of them. And I have my variables. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Lucky 7. So I'll be using these 7 variables to group these 27 respondents into smaller subgroups or segments or clusters, if you will. Again, I'll use segment, cluster, and group kind of interchangeably to represent the idea of a small group of homogeneous customers that are different from members of the other groups. So what are the variables we're going to segment them on? How important these different attributes were for them in terms of holding season tickets and valuing those season tickets. So we got information on how important entertaining guests was to the season ticket holder, how important business opportunities, networking, seeing and being seen, at a basketball game. You can do that sometimes. Also the cathartic experience, just the pure entertainment, escape from your day-to-day. The community spirit, feeling a part of a community, cheering for the same team, win together, lose together. One of the appeals of going to sporting events for some people. People that love basketball, right? That would make sense for us to target those customers. You could go to games and not be huge into basketball, just kind of enjoy the atmosphere and entertaining guests. So we want to probably focus on those who are especially keen about basketball. This variable is the amount of money they're willing to invest in Sonics. Let's say maybe as an owner or just putting money into the effort to bring the team back. Obviously, this would make someone particularly interesting to us. So if we saw a segment that had certain good attributes and also were willing to invest some money in bringing the Sonics back to us, we'd want them a part of our coalition. And finally, kind of directly asking about kind of the attractiveness of someone in terms of what we intend to do. We asked them what was their interest on a 1 to 5 scale of having a team return to Seattle. Now, that's a nice variable for us to pick a target segment to go after and directly aligns with our mission. So these are the variables for which customers will be grouped as similar or dissimilar. The software is going to look at the patterns in their responses and find subgroups where patterns are similar to each other and dissimilar from other customers. When we look at the respondents, we see all of their names. It looks like some of these names are businesses and some are more individuals. That makes sense. Businesses can own season tickets. We also see how many respondents we have. Like I said, we have 27. The more respondents we have, the more confident we can be in our results that they weren't just due to some random characteristic of the sample or some, error in how someone filled out their survey. With a larger set of respondents, we can describe the market or a set of customers in more detail. We can allow for there to be more segments, and we can have segments that represent a smaller percentage of the total market. But as we get more detail oriented, sometimes we stop having the benefit of coming up with a comprehensive strategy and we can get overwhelmed by all the nuances. So like I said, the rule of thumb, generally 3 to 5 segments when you first start, and also the least amount of respondents you want to have per segment in your smallest segment would be about 15 survey respondents. In this case, that's not going to be possible. But the larger the consequences of the decisions that I'm going to make using the results of my analysis, the greater the effort I'll put into collecting a large and perfectly representative sample. In this case, I'm just doing something quick to try to gain a little bit of insights and quickly put together a coalition. So another nice thing about the software, the output, is it's going to give us an indication of how confident we can be that any reported differences between groups of customers are either actually different with an indication of statistical significance, or whether it's just an anomaly, whether one group answering 4 and another group answering 3 is just based on kind of some random error in our sample. And that accounts for it being a small sample size. So even with a small sample, we still can gain some insights that we can be confident are real. We can have some confidence that there's real differences. And you'll see that when we go to the output. Okay, the second tab, see this is one tab, this is about the needs. So that's what we're going to group customers on. The second tab down here is discrimination data. It has the exact same set of respondents. We're not going to split customers into groups based on this information. We don't want to say that the number of years is why we want to go after a person or not in terms of trying to get them into our coalition. We first are going to split them into groups based on the segmentation data in the first tab, and then we'll see if this descriptive data correlates with group membership, and we can see how predictive something like number of years is in terms of being a part of our key segment we want to go after. You can see that the respondents match. That's really important. They have to be in the same order. And you can also see some information that is generally available, and that'll be helpful in terms of predicting other people who might be in our target segment. And we have that information down in our third tab. So this information came from the team CRM system. It had this information on every season ticket holder, not just on those who filled out the survey. And if we had the contact information, we could try to predict who out of all the season ticket holders are going to belong to our target segment and try to contact them directly. So this third tab, it's discriminant data on all season ticket holders. And if we look at this, is the first season ticket holder by their ID. And it's the same four variables: company owned versus individual owned, number of years holding tickets, location of the seats, being general, low price seats, luxury seats, or the suites. And we also know whether or not they held season tickets to the Mariners, the baseball team, or the Seahawks, the football team. And we see that there's a bunch more season ticket holders who we have this data on. We don't have the survey data for these people. There's 400 of them. When I hit end and down, we skip to the bottom, and we see there's 400 respondents. So the Sonic CRM system kept track of all this information before they left town, and I was able to access it. Great. Let's go back to our segmentation tab. Now, once we've installed the software, marketing engineering software, it'll be under the add-ins tab. You'll find it there. Look up for your version of Excel how to find add-ins. And then this is the marketing engineering for Excel logo. There's lots of different analyses that you can run using this software, so it's very powerful, and you can become a mini consultant overnight. For each analysis, there's a tutorial, a PDF, and that kind of gives you a nice step-by-step overview of how to go through the process. It doesn't imply where you need to add judgment so much, but it's very descriptive of how to just basically click the buttons and what are the options, which I'm also going to provide to you in this video. What are we going to do? We're going to go down to segmentation. That's the exercise we're trying to do, and we're going to run segmentation. If we hadn't had the data already set up, we could create a template that would allow us to structure the data in terms of having a tab for segmentation, a tab for discriminant data, etc. One issue when you're creating your own template, which you don't have to do for the homework, but you might need to do for like a group assignment, or if you're actually going to use this software in reality, is you have to be careful with how you handle missing data. That's one thing that you'll have to set up correctly before you run your analysis. And another thing that people often have problems with is when they ask something categorical variables, such as what major were you in college. Oftentimes we use that in trying to understand the discriminant data, some descriptors. Anything that is not so much on a numerical scale, but more just an identifier. When you do it in a survey, sometimes when you download the results, it would say that, for instance, if we asked about what major you were in college, and we gave survey respondents 4 options, let's say engineering, business, liberal arts, or other, when you download the results from your survey, it might group those all under one variable and say that engineering's 1, 2 is business, 3 is liberal arts, and a score of 4 equals other. The problem with that is it implies to the software that 4 is greater than 3, is greater than 2, is greater than 1, 4 is 4 times as much as 1, But these are just categories. 4 is not actually, other is not 4 times better or bigger than engineering. So what you want to do is split that out into 3 yes/no questions. We have a yes/no column for engineering. That would be a 1 or a 0, 1 for yes. You'd have a yes/no column for business and a yes/no column for liberal arts. You wouldn't need a column for your 4th category because you would already know. It would be implied that if someone wasn't business and they weren't liberal arts or engineering, then by default it would be your 4th category. So if you can structure that correctly and set your template up, you can enter your data and then be ready to run analysis. In this example, everything's been set up. Hooray. Same thing with the homework. They've already collected the data. You inherit it with all its problems and strengths, and then you just move forward aware of any assumptions or biases that may have gone into the data that was generated. So when we click run segmentation, you guys are probably all ready for this. We come up with this nice, let's say, options page. Please select the options to run cluster analysis. And when I say run a segmentation, technically it's a cluster analysis because you're clustering together groups of individuals that have similar statistical patterns across the variables. Okay. First is the analysis options box, and we need to decide basically what type of analysis we want to do and how many clusters, how many groups do we want to use to describe the set of customers. Do we want to say we can group all the customers into 2 groups, 3 groups, 4 groups, 5 groups? Right now it's set up as 5, but we could change that if we wanted to. We don't want to be too nuanced and say there's 10 different groups. We'll be paralyzed by information overload. This is the first time we're grouping customers. Also, with a small sample size, I can't be too fine-grained. Once you get a handle on it, if you have a bigger sample size, you could certainly do a lot more number of clusters. But you want to describe the set of customers by the amount of groups where there truly are differences between each customer group, and you're not forcing there to be differences that really aren't important. So if there should only be 3 groups of customers, 3 segments based on reality, but I force them into 5, I'll be splitting hairs between segments where the differences aren't that meaningful. We don't really know ahead of time what the right number is, and the nice thing about marketing and engineering is it helps us figure that out. The first time you run the analysis, you always want this number to be greater than the kind of potential it could be. So you want to err on the high side. As a rule of thumb, I generally suggest doing 3 to 5 as your final set of clusters to classify the market set. But if you're going to start out with, let's say, 3 to 5, then you want to bump this up to something like 7 or 9 to start, to do your first glance at. In this case, with such a small sample, I'll just start at 5. But for your homework, I would start at 7 or 9. So next, hierarchical clustering, or k-means. For your homework, use hierarchical clustering. Okay? The best thing about k-means is that it can quickly analyze really large datasets in the thousands. Hierarchical clustering takes longer to analyze for the computer, but with a small sample size like 27, it's no problem. It's only a problem when you get into the thousands. Okay, the next set of options is segmentation data. And you need to decide if you want to have the analysis do any transformations to your data before it runs the analysis to group customers. If you select the first option, no transformation, just keep the data as it is originally entered, you're exposing yourself to some potential problem. Don't do that. Please don't do that. It's much safer just to always do standardized data. The reason being is, in this case and also in the case of your homework, some variables are on a scale like 1 to 5, and maybe another variable is on a scale where you see the high value is 80 and the low value is 0. If we don't standardize the variables and kind of make them free of the scale, it might overweight differences between 80 and 30 as a huge difference, where over here a difference between 4 and 5 would seem much smaller. So we need to standardize. Basically, you have variables on a different scale. Standardize, standardize, standardize. The third option, to reduce data through factor analysis, that's more complex than is needed at this point. If you're interested in how you would do that, we could talk outside of this presentation. You can contact me. You can also just Google factor analysis. Basically, you would use it when you have kind of a pretty large survey and you ask about a particular thing in multiple ways, and you want to kind of abstract up from your survey questions to a more high level thing. Just do standardized data and make sure you save that choice in the current spreadsheet so that every time you run the analysis, your data gets standardized before they group customer. Let's go on to display options. This is your third set of options. You just make sure you click statistical differences. Don't worry about the other two. Statistical differences highlights the most meaningful differences between groups, and it's helpful and very informative. The other options are less informative, so click that one. Basically, it'll help increase your confidence that a high or low score on a variable for a particular segment of customers is, if it's very consistent, if they're consistently high or consistently low, the software will detect that there's some statistical significance behind that difference, which basically says, hey, you can be pretty confident that this group happens to really care about that variable, or they don't care about it if it happens to be low. And you'll see that in the output. And it's really good when you have a small sample size, because it can say, despite the small sample size, this particular group of customers, we have strong confidence that they care about passion for basketball, for example. And you'll see that in the output. Okay, the final option you can kind of look at is, do you want to enable discriminant analysis? The only time you would uncheck that is if you were working with a large data set and you didn't want it to perform that analysis until you were pretty sure how many clusters you wanted to do, or if you didn't collect discriminant data. If you only had segmentation data, obviously you couldn't do the analysis if you don't have this second tab with discrimination data. So you would know if it's possible ahead of time. So after clicking next, you just have to verify that the inputs the software thinks are correct. So the segmentation data is contained here as it was already finding. You click OK. And the discriminant data is contained here on this tab. And if it's already highlighted, you can just click OK. And if it's not highlighted, you need to highlight it. Once you click OK, you'll have a new Excel workbook pop up with a set of results, and I'm going to walk you through the results and how to interpret them. And that's really the hard part of the homework, is how to make decisions based on the output of the results. Because the data has already been set up for you, you're now left to just really interpret and use it for insight. If you look at this new workbook, there's 5 tabs, right? And the first 2 simply carry forward the original data from your original workbook, the segmentation data and the discriminant data. It's contained in this new workbook. Not so important for you to look at. The segmentation tab, it tells you a few things, and you need to learn how to interpret them. So I'll walk you through it right now. First, we see cluster sizes or segment sizes. We know that the overall sample has 27 observations, 27 respondents. And if it splits those 27 up into 5 different clusters based on similarity, it will say that one cluster has 4 respondents, cluster 2 has 8, cluster 3 has 7, cluster 4 has 5, and cluster 5 has 3. These are all very, very small numbers, probably too small or smaller than would be preferred in the ideal case. But at least all of them have at least 10% of the total sample in the cluster. So you can see the proportion. If one of these was only maybe one respondent, it probably wouldn't be worthwhile to say it is its own segment of clusters, unless it was very, very different from the rest. Okay. One thing you might know is The segment size could be an indicator of attractiveness. Oftentimes it's good to target a large segment, but the problem is that is only informative if your original sample is representative of the overall marketplace. If you have a biased sample, then one segment might be larger or smaller than it actually is in reality. So you can use this information as an indication of how big a market is, how big a segment is, but you need to take it with a grain of salt if you think your sample isn't truly representative of the real world total set of customers in the marketplace. Okay, the segmentation variables table, this table right here, this is where you gain, let's say, the most insights about kind of understanding what each cluster cares about. And so I'm going to adjust this first column so I can see what each variable is, and I might rename the variables to make them fit in understanding them. I see how my overall set of respondents scored their average scores on all these variables. So a nice thing is on a 1 to 5 scale, everything is in the 3s. That means that I didn't kind of have any survey questions that were so obvious everyone hit a 5 or everyone hit as a 1. And if you're in the middle, it probably means there's some clusters that are high and some clusters that are low on each variable. For the average amount in thousands that respondent was willing to invest in the Sonics, they indicated 17,000. But that could be kind of pulled up by a few outliers who were really enthusiastic and rich, such as, let's say, a Bill Gates or something. If he was in my sample, maybe he would be willing to invest more. So the overall sample average here might not be that informative. What we want to do is look at, for each cluster, where were they very high or very low. And if it's highlighted in green, bold green, such as a 3.75 for entertaining guess, that means we have statistical significance that this value is higher than the sample average. And it's higher in a way that we're fairly confident is real. So we're fairly confident that cluster 1 prefers entertaining guess more so than the average customer. And so that helps us learn about cluster 1. We also see that they're into feeling a part of community spirit. They have strong passion for basketball, a really high score, and a score that's higher than the overall average. They have a lot of money they're willing to invest, and they're interested in a team returning to Seattle. So that looks like great news. The problem here is it's just 4 people. So they found the 4 people that had all these things they cared about and were very, very, very interested in a team return to Seattle and willing to invest a lot. So cluster 1, is a potential target. We might indicate that as someone to look at more closely. Cluster 2, they liked entertaining guests, they liked business opportunities, but here we have a red bold number, which means they cared less than average about feeling a part of community spirit. Maybe they weren't very social, if you will, or they just don't care about the community aspect of going to games that much. And they also weren't very interested in a team returning to Seattle. Maybe they were mad that the team left and they took it personally, and they're below average in their interest in a team return to Seattle. So we probably aren't interested in going after members of cluster 2. Unfortunately, that was the largest cluster when we grouped the set of customers into 5 groups. And that's okay, sometimes it's better to find the right set of customers where you can make a nice profit, where you can be very effective with your marketing efforts rather than going after the largest cluster where you can't necessarily make a large profit. Cluster 3, we see they're not into entertaining guests. Business opportunities are not important to them when being a season ticket holder, but they loved, more so than everyone else, they were really into escape from the day-to-day cathartic. They were also into basketball, about equally as much as cluster 1, and more so than average. It's highlighted in green and bold. They also will put some money into investing in a team to return to Seattle, and they have a strong interest in a team return to Seattle. Okay, so that also looks like a potential target. And so what we want to know is, do we want to target them? It's a larger group. They have less money. Or do we want to target cluster 1? And so we'll have to think about that as we move forward. If we were to target both, we might have to, emphasize things they have in common, such as passion for basketball, and make sure not to talk about how good the Sonics were for entertaining guests, because they both don't share that commonality on that variable. So you see, we can really start to interpret these scores and learn about our customer. Another thing to kind of consider is what would happen if we group these together in like a higher cluster. It'd be interesting to see if we went to describing the set of customers, the total set of customers in maybe 2 or 3 cluster groups, if they would end up being combined. Okay, so I'm not going to walk through all of these targets, segments, and really go through each of them in detail. Basically, we want to know where each cluster stands out from the other clusters on terms of the variables that we measure. And that's going to help us inform, how attractive a segment is, and also can help us change our positioning and what we emphasize and our product and our go-to-market strategy to kind of match to what they care about most and not emphasize things that they don't care about. All right. So cluster 1 and cluster 3, they scored very well. Cluster 5 is about average on a lot of things, especially our kind of 2 that we care about most in terms of willing to invest and an interest in a team coming back to Seattle. If I had a lot of resources, I might reach out to this set of customers, as long as targeting them would not compromise my ability to target the other 2, which seem more attractive. For instance, what if cluster 5's interest in business opportunities turned off cluster 3 target segment who didn't care about that? Maybe they thought that other group of customers was too focused on business. I would be concerned that each of these segments' needs might clash, and especially when you think about traditional business and segmentation, you would be exposed to a competitor that would be more able to split that difference and focus on either the business opportunities for cluster 5 or kind of not emphasizing that for cluster 3. Okay, so I want to know, how I rate up against my competitors. I want to know where I'm particularly strong. This is for picking a target, right? We want to know the attractiveness, and we also want to know our relative strength compared to competitors or other opportunities. And so one thing that I recommend is create your own column. You could say me, and you could do a competitor 1. And let's say you have 3 competitors you care about. You might want to rank yourself and your competitors on the same scale in terms of what you provide on these variables. And that could give you an indication of your own competitive strength. Okay, so in this case, I think I might score pretty high compared to other entertainment options for things like networking. Go to a game and network. It seems like some people like that about the Sonic, so maybe I'll do a 4 for myself. Entertaining guests, pretty good. It's kind of a social atmosphere. You can talk during timeouts. Escape from day to day. I don't know, maybe I'm average compared to, all the entertainment options out there, such as other sports, the arts, dining. I'd, try to be honest. Feeling a part of a community spirit, I think sports are especially strong for that. You win and lose together. I'll say a 5, although, some of my competitors, let's say this is another sports team, maybe a baseball or a football or soccer team, they would also be a 5. If competitor 2 was something like dining or just going to the theater, I think it would probably be a little bit lower. So you would do this for yourself and for each of your competitors, and that would give you an indication of your strength. Once you have these numbers, you could create another column, and you could look at contrast scores. So me versus, let's say, cluster 1. And I could just do my distance. So I could say equals cluster 1 minus, my score. And I might see for each cluster how far away I was on giving them what they want. And I might want to look at that relative to competition. Ideally, in the real world, you would want customers to give you this insight. You want their opinion of how you stack up on every dimension versus your competitors. And that's how you would do a positioning study. You'd want to know their preferences. You would want to know their perceptions. But if you don't have the opportunity to get customer input, if I was short on time, I might just have my employees, my managers, rate ourselves and our competitors. And I'd be sure to get a nice diverse representation of the employees and managers, because engineers could have a very different perception than salespeople. Depending on customer service, salespeople might rate themselves as high, and on engineering competency, engineers might rate themselves as high, but obviously they're biased. And so if you can't get the customer's point of view, at least take the time to think through and be very careful. For your case, you're going to need to pick a target segment, and you're going to want to focus on where you have competitive strengths. So if I had these different scores, I would have a sense of competitive fit. Another analysis you can do in marketing engineering is the GE portfolio matrix. And if you look at that tutorial, you can see how you use ratings of competitive fit and attractiveness to evaluate which segments to target. So that's something to be aware of, but we're not going to do it in today's lesson. Okay, so this is really important. The one thing I want to point out is this is a snapshot in time. And so you might also want to do this same process in terms of looking at scores and rating yourself and rating how you compare to each cluster forward-looking. Do a projection. And that can help you also build sustainable competitive advantage and know where you need to make changes to better fit what your target segment wants. And also you'd want to evaluate, can we do better on certain dimensions? Maybe you match up on 4 out of 5 of the variables they care about, so how can you change that 5th variable? You need to think about your strategy. You need to think about your brand portfolio, your customer portfolio. There's lots of strategic considerations I'd want you to take into account when picking who to target now and who to target into the future, and this is the best place to start. So let's say I pick a target segment. In this case, maybe I'll go after cluster 3 would be my first priority. Cluster 1 maybe would be my backup. They're just kind of small. I'd see how well I am at identifying them and how costly it would be to reach them. But I might want to take my chances where it's a little bit bigger of a segment. Maybe I could go after both over time. Maybe I start with one and go to the other. You have to think about how do you go to market with this information once you have a plan in place and what's feasible and how costly it is. Okay, now I want to look at our third piece of information, and you can read the description. But basically what this does is it says for each respondent, what group were they put into? What's their membership? And right now, I described all the customers as fitting into one of 5 different groups. So you can see who's in group 1. It looks like Microsoft, Dune and Associates, Michael Smith down here, and Nate Robertson. They were all the members of cluster 1. I can also see who was in cluster 3. Maybe I want to sort this, right? I could go to custom sort, and I could do it by 5 clusters, smallest to largest. And so I can see who's a part of each cluster. These people are in cluster 1, these people are in cluster 2, and these people are in cluster 3, based on their how they filled out the survey on needs and benefits that they want. Another cool thing you can see is, okay, that's with telling the software do 5 clusters, but you can also see what happens to membership if it were to redescribe the total set of customers as belonging into 4 groups. and we see these members of 5, Chinooks, Costco, and Stas Company, who are currently described as being part of group 5, would be put into group number 4. And then we'd also see if we went down to 3 clusters, all those people in 4 would be put into group number 2. So they would be smushed in with these people up here. And then if we went down to just 2 groupings, describing everyone 2 groupings, we would see that cluster 1 and cluster 3 would be combined together. And so that's kind of how similar customers are to each other. You could also see what happens if I went to 6 clusters. Where would 6 come from? And in this case, they would just have one member of cluster 6. It would be Philips Electric would belong in its own little group of 1. So I guess Philips Electric is the most different survey respondent than everyone else. They might just be their own individual outlier. So this can kind of help me inform, would I want to consider redescribing my market with just 4 clusters? In this case, if I went down to 2 clusters, both of my potential targets would be put together. Group 1 and group 3 would end up being put together, so that's kind of interesting if I went down to 2. Another thing to notice is, at 5 or 6, the changes are all happening in groups that I don't really care about. And, down to cluster 4, I'm combining 4 and 5 together. That's what we see. All these 3 people who were in group 5 move into group 4. And if I look back up here, I can see, okay, where are they the same and where are they different? And, what would that change mean strategically in terms of interpreting it? Right now, if I wanted to be aggressive and go after 3 segments, cluster 5 might be the one I would go after. But there's no way I'd want to go after cluster 4. They're not interested in a team returning to Seattle, and they're not willing to put any money into it. So I'd have to decide, do I want to keep cluster 5 as separate from a strategic standpoint? Does it add value to keep them as their own group? Or would I like to simplify things and have them just be grouped in with cluster 4? They score almost identically on entertaining guests. They're both high on business opportunities, but cluster 5 is much higher. They're both low on escape from day to day, but cluster 5 is lower. Here's a big difference. Cluster 5 cares a lot about feeling a part of community, where cluster 4 is just like, whatever. So you want to understand those differences if you are going to put them together, and I could redo my analysis in 4 clusters. I could also redo my analysis with 3 clusters, and then cluster 2 would be combined with cluster 4 and 5. That seems fine to me right now because neither of them are in my target segments, and so I really want to make sure I understand the nuanced differences between the segments that I'm strongly considering going after. So that kind of brings me to this next idea, which is how many groupings of customers or how many clusters is best to describe a marketplace. And if you do your first analysis, your first run with a high number of clusters, you're not going to get that much insights out of this chart. And so what you should do is before you say, let's do 5 clusters to describe the market, the total set of customers, or let's do 4 or 3, you should look at the dendrogram, okay? And I want to show you what the dendrogram is now and describe it. It can be very, very confusing to some students, and so I'll try to walk this through for you and explain it very kind of logically and simply, and hopefully it helps it make sense, because it's the best kind of purely statistical, free of judgment way of saying, how similar are customers to each other, how different are the groups from each other, and what would the software kind of recommend as how many groups to use. So it uses pure statistical patterns. These are just patterns in the data. And it indicates trade-offs in redoing the analysis with fewer segments versus redoing the analysis with more segments. First, let me point out this bottom axis is the label of the cluster ID. And these correspond with those same groupings that we just looked at. And right now we asked it to group customers into 5 groups, and so we see at the bottom there's 5 different groups of customers, different segments. And looking at the image, we can see which segments are combined as I move towards a simpler and simpler description of the marketplace. So if instead of describing the market in 5 groups of customers, I wanted to do it in 4, I see that group 4 and 5 are combined here into a kind of larger supergroup. The next pair of groupings that would happen if I wanted to go to a 3-segment solution is I would combine group 2 with this bigger group of 4 and 5, and they'd go together in this 3. So horizontal lines indicate the combination of a group, and the vertical lines right above the horizontal lines indicate how many groups you'd have left. So in this case, I would have this cluster 1, this cluster, and this cluster. So I would have 3 total clusters once I combined 2 with 4 and 5. And I might want to consider that as kind of a simpler way to describe the marketplace. Especially I only had 27 respondents, so consolidating some of these probably makes sense. The next thing to note is we have this vertical axis, and it's labeled as distance. And you say, distance, what? This is like an abstract distance idea. And I want to use a metaphor or an analogy to help it kind of come to life. So there are several different ways that people describe and think about this number, and the way I describe it is the way that makes the most sense to me. If you were taught to think about it in a different way, it's not going to change the implications, so that's fine. But let's start by thinking of each customer, the total customers, all 27, living somewhere on a map. This, if you think about the US. And each customer lives at a separate house on the map, so this is the metaphor. And some houses obviously are closer together in neighborhoods and in cities and in kind of regions. And then some are further out by themselves, and some are in completely different cities. And so right now with 5 clusters, we could think of these as kind of 5 different cities where customers are living close to each other. And if we start at the top of the dendrogram, the distance number is 2.93. Okay, so in one big abstract group, there's total amount of distance between all the houses. If we were to drive between each house on our map, each person living, it would take us 2.93 to go from every house to every other house. So in this one big abstract group, we don't know anything about the customers. We know the overall average, but we don't know subtleties about what makes customers different from each other. And that's why we did the segmentation analysis to gain. And so let's pretend this is at the state level, maybe the state of California. So 2.93 is the distance of all the houses from each other in California. And when we look at the bottom, we have 5 cities in California. These 5 clusters represent groupings of customers where they're close to each other but far away from everyone else. Everyone in the city is pretty much similar in terms of where they live. So it's not too bad of an oversimplification to start viewing customers at the city level rather than where we were at the start, viewing them at the state level. But some of these cities are actually pretty close to each other in terms of distance. You could think of, in California, we have San Francisco and Oakland. They're both part of the Bay Area. And so instead of saying, let's think about San Francisco and Oakland as different from each other, we could say, no, let's think about them as the Bay Area. And that's this more abstract grouping where we lose some of the subtleties of the differences between San Francisco and Oakland, but overall they're similar enough that the software thinks they kind of live close to each other in terms of their needs and wants. And in that case, the software gives us an indication of how dissimilar they actually are. And it says that the total distance in this group, if we combine them together, is actually 0.34. And if we ignore that difference, that 0.34, that's information we're going to lose. And we want to say, is that a big deal? Is that a problem? Well, we want to reference it to the total amount of distance in the state, this 2.93 number. The kind of subtleties that we lose by saying that these 2 cities, which are actually 0.34 apart, we're going to think of them as one big region, is only 12% of the total distance in our system in California. And 12% at this point doesn't seem like a huge oversimplification. It might be reasonable to combine them together as a starting point. So we reference the distance, that's kind of the information lost by combining them together, the simplification, to the overall total simplification if we just had one big abstract group of customers. Next, we could continue to simplify California. We could combine cluster 2 with cluster 4 and 5, the Bay Area. And this could be like adding Sacramento to the Bay Area and just calling it Northern California. So the amount of difference jumps up from 0.34 to 0.67. So there's about twice as much distance between Sacramento and the Bay Area than there was between Oakland and San Francisco. And that's going to mean about twice as much information is lost. And if we compare 0.67, the total amount of information we kind of ignore, the subtleties we ignore when we think of Northern California as one abstract group, compared to the Bay Area, keeping it separate from Sacramento, it's twice as bad. And so we've lost twice as much information. And we might think, oh, we shouldn't do that. We'd have to look at the ramifications from the segmentation data to judge that. But from a purely statistical standpoint, we've now jumped up to 0.67 out of 293. That's 23% of the information that could be lost when we abstract is being lost as we get to this level of group. We could continue to move forward. We could continue to simplify things. The next two groups that are put together would be group 1 with group 3. Remember, those are kind of our two targets we're considering. The amount of information lost when we combine those together is again higher. It's now 0.74 for that grouping. That's about how much information is lost when we try to treat group 1 as the same as group 3. If we think about that grouping is 0.74 and this grouping is 0.67, add those together and divide it by the total system-wide, we've now kind of oversimplified things quite a bit. And we're actually at 0.67 plus 0.74 divided by 2.93 is about 48%. So 48% of the information, the differences between customers that exist, is not accounted for when we group them into two groups compared to grouping them in one group. So we've gained, about half of the important differences are accounted for in the original split from one abstract group into two groupings, but half of the important information is ignored. So that might be a bridge too far. And I definitely, based on this, wouldn't go further than 0.67. That would be my cutoff. So, like most segmentations, 3 groups is usually the minimum you would want to do. So I could rerun my analysis now with 3 groups. But just to save time, I'm going to stick with my 5-group solution to move forward. Okay, so what you have to do is compare about how much information do you lose in the abstract sense when you combine groups, and you want to find a level of information in reference to the total amount of information isn't too much. And you look for when there's big jumps in loss of information and when the total amount of loss of information as you group customers together becomes exceedingly high. Never go over 50%. You might as well not have done any segmentation. Okay, so let's look at the discrimination tab. This is more insight into who our customers are. And the first thing we can learn is how well our descriptive data is able to predict group membership. And we can also learn how we could describe our groups in terms of things that are relatively easy for us to observe about customers. So this information, again, let's look at what variables we have. Company owned, location of seats, if they hold other season tickets, and the amount of time they've been holding season tickets. All of those are relatively easy for us to acquire that information because we have a CRM system on our customers. And so we could use that to say, does it predict cluster membership? We also have cluster sizes. We already have seen this, so it hasn't changed. We could write the names of the clusters we want to focus on. Again, we are considering going after cluster 1 and cluster 3. All these other clusters kind of combine together, so I could redo my analysis with just 3 clusters. But I'm trying to focus on these two, so I'll just ignore cluster 2, cluster 4, and cluster 5 for now. I've already decided to focus on cluster 1 and 3, and I'm deciding which one to go after. I know what can I learn. Well, cluster 1 sits in nice seats, either luxury or a suite, and they also have been holding season tickets for a long time. And for cluster 3, I know that they're almost all individuals, or it looks like they are all individuals because they're a score of 2 is their average score on this variable. And the majority of them do not hold season tickets to the Mariners or the Seahawks. That's something that stands out. They have slightly above average length of time, but they don't stand out from the crowd in terms of that number. Okay. The discriminant function is difficult to interpret. It doesn't really come into any interpretations for you for your homework, so I'm just going to skip it. It's basically related to just predicting segment membership based on discriminant data. And if you have an additional set of customers, you can use this to help predict. Basically, you use it, well, you don't actually use it, you use down here the classification weights and the classification coefficients, which relate to these discriminant functions. And basically they say, if I have the same set of data on another group of customers, I can use this information to predict segment membership. But let's ignore that. Okay. The confusion matrix actually is important. Okay, what does it do? It tries to predict what segment each customer would belong to based on the discriminant data, the descriptor data. And it also knows what segment each customer actually belongs to, their actual segment membership, based on the segment data. And it compares and contrasts how accurate it was able to predict segment membership based on their actual membership and their predicted membership. The actual membership is based on their answers for segmentation, and predicted membership is based on their answers for discrimination data that correlates to the segmentation data. So if we compare actual to predicted, there were 4 people that were actually in cluster 1, but the problem is the prediction said they were in cluster 3, cluster 4, or cluster 5. So if we look at the hit rate down here, the accuracy of predicting membership in cluster 1, it's actually 0%. And that's a big problem if we're trying to do direct marketing and target people in cluster 1. For cluster 3, our other segment we're thinking about going after, it said that there were 7 members of cluster 3. And for those 7 members, we see that 5 of them were correctly predicted to be in cluster 3. That's awesome. But 2 of them were actually predicted to be in cluster 4. Not so awesome. Another issue is if we go after people predicted to be in cluster 3, well, about half the time, a little less than half the time, we'll actually find people who are cluster 4, and they'll probably not be very receptive to our pitch. But sometimes we might find someone in cluster 1, and that's not a big problem because they're also pretty receptive to what we're trying to do. This kind of confirms that cluster 3 would be a good group to go after, and actually one that we would be able to go after with the information we have on all season ticket holders, their descriptive data. So the hit rate, they do it by cluster. The hit rate, 5 out of 7, is 71%. Cluster 3, we are able to correctly identify a member of cluster 3 as cluster 3 71% of the time. Now this is a small sample size, right? 27 people. So I wouldn't want to put too much emphasis on this prediction if I was going to go through some costly decision making. But if I was just going to do some outbound direct marketing calls or emails to people, and I was going to tailor the message to what I think cluster 3 cares about, and I was going to focus my efforts on cluster 3 to save costs and focus my energy and time and efforts, then 71% hit rate might work. Ideally you would understand the cost of going after cluster 3. You would also know what the potential return is of going after cluster 3. And so if you could identify them 71% of the time, you'd also want to consider How often do you convert them? How often do you successfully acquire them or get them to do what you're hoping to have them do? And taking that all into consideration, that's the strategic implication of this hit rate. And you could do an ROI analysis. I'm not going to ask you to do that for your homework assignment, but I am going to ask you to think about what are the implications of the hit rate. Let's say you wanted to go after cluster 1. Well, you would need to try to gather or buy or acquire somehow more descriptor variables that would better predict membership in cluster 1. Because although we have them being more likely to hold nice seats and more likely to have held season tickets, they were just being predicted to be a member of a different group than cluster 1. So maybe a larger sample size would help get this hit rate up, or maybe we need to add a few more variables such as income or where they live or their media habits, the size of their company. I don't know. You could potentially, if you had some contact information for them, you could merge in additional data that you could also acquire on all the other season ticket holders. So sometimes you think about acquiring more data after the fact, after you've already done your survey, merging in some other data you could buy to get your hit rate up higher. Okay, so that's basically how you do your interpretation. That's kind of all you need to know for your homework assignment. If you can follow this example and kind of think about everything I just said, you can do a reasonably to good job on your homework assignment. If you want to rerun your analysis, with less groups, you would go back to your original data set and you would say add-ins, marketing engineering for Excel, run segmentation. Maybe I would change it to 3. That was one thing I was considering. Make sure all the other options are correct. Hit OK. And you can see how going down to 3 impacts your segmentation results. Cluster 1 and cluster 3 are the exact same. Basically all your non-attractive customers have been grouped into cluster 2. You see that there's still only 4 people in cluster 1 and still only 7 people in cluster 3. But cluster 2 is like your cluster of let's just ignore them. In terms of discrimination data, you can look at if it impacted your hit rate. And this is where it gets really, really nice. Actually now, with this simpler view of the market, your hit rate for cluster 1 has gone up to 75%, and your hit rate for cluster 3 has gone up to 85%. So of 4 people, you correctly predicted 3 right in cluster 1. If I wanted to go after cluster 1, just by rerunning my analysis and making things simpler in terms of all those other segments, I was better able to use my 4 variables that I had discriminant data to predict their membership. And so that's kind of a neat thing about, once you know who you want to go after, you can see how they get combined with other groups and try to rerun the analysis to get different results. So I'm pretty happy with this hit rate. And I know that cluster 1's attractive. I know that cluster 3 is attractive. Let's say I want to now go ahead and identify other people who might be part of cluster 1 or cluster 3, and then I'll go ahead and try to call them, contact them myself, talk about what we could do, the type of coalition we're going to form, and try to see if I can get them on board. And so I have 400 season ticket holders, right? If I go back to my original workbook, I don't need to say book 2. That was the 5 cluster solution. So I have 400 season ticket holders where I have the discriminant data on all of them. And let's say I also had their contact information. I might want to predict which ones were in segment 1 and which ones were in segment 3. And using that, I could tailor my message, and I could also contact them and try to be, instead of contacting all 400, I only contact the ones who are in my target segments, who are likely to have a positive response to what I have to say. And so this gets down into implementation, and this is more appropriate for direct marketing rather than high-level strategy. But it's very cool, and I want to show you the power of the data, so I'll run this exercise very quickly. So what I do is I want to go back to my results for where my hit rate is high, and I want to go ahead and go and run my classification exercise, which will predict it. So how do I do that? I go to my add-ins, Marketing Engineering for Excel, and I go Run Classification. Okay, you're going to have to kind of look through the PDF to make sure you select everything correctly, but if you've run the first analysis, it should work okay. And after you've done the classification weights and the classification coefficients, you just have to find where your data is on all your customers. So in mine, it's in my workbook that's open called Segmentation Example Sonics 3. And when I open it, I just need to select all of this data. There's 400 people. I select all 400. And what's cool is for all 400, it now comes up. See, I have all 400 of them. I have a prediction of which segment they belong to. And it's this last column. So I still have the descriptor data, if they're a company or individual, season ticket holders, etc. But I also have this nice one called predicted cluster. So one thing that I can do with that is I can go ahead and sort them, let's say. That's not how I want to do it. Excuse me. I need to get rid of this column. So I could sort these customers by their segment membership or their predicted segment membership. Predicted cluster. And all these people are in cluster 1. They're predicted to be in cluster 1. We think about 75% of the time we'll be accurate with that prediction. So I'd contact all of them and focus on what they care about, what needs and benefits they're probably missing now that Sonics have left. And I would also go after segment 3. In this case, direct marketing, it's pretty easy to go after multiple segments and tailor your offering as long as you have the resources and the time to go after a bunch of customers. But if I was doing a mailer, let's say, I was going to send something on the mail rather than call them. Let's say I had their address. I might need to just pick one because they're actually different from each other. And, cluster 3 is almost all individuals. They have a little bit different needs and wants. And I don't want to tell them things that they don't really care about. All right, so that's the end of the example. I hope you can kind of see how it would be helpful to businesses. Even with this small example, I only surveyed 27 respondents. It could really inform a direct marketing campaign. Let me go back to the presentation. So to wrap up, I want to talk about the homework assignment, this Marketing Engineering Excel segmentation case. Some bullet points that I want you to consider as you do the homework. So first, read the case background. You got to think about what the past was and then project, okay, what are they currently doing? What's their product? What's their brand? Where they fit compared to the competitive landscape? And also project into the future. So think about the company, their strengths, their weaknesses, their competitors, how they compare to their competitors now and into the future, and their customers. What do their customers want now, and how is that marketplace going to be changing into the future? With all that as the background, you need to look at the survey. You need to see who the respondents are and what the questions are, and translate those questions to the case background so you can have an idea of how the results of your analysis will impact your decision of who to target based on where you have good competitive fit and attractiveness. You also need to look at the spreadsheet and compare it to the case file, the PDF, to understand how the data was generated. Where might there be biases? Were there some people not surveyed? And what would be that implication? Were there certain questions that were asked in a funny way or maybe shouldn't have been asked? And how does each question kind of translate to what you know about the company's strengths and the competitor's relative strengths? For the segmentation analysis, you're going to have to use the dendrogram and your judgment to decide how many segments you should use to categorize the marketplace. And you're going to want to understand the differences and similarities across segments. So that's that really interpretation of the segmentation output table. You need to understand the difference between their needs and their descriptors. There's some questions on media habits, if they read certain magazines. Obviously, that could be something you could take in your go-to-market strategy. But understand that just because they asked about something like, do they read a particular magazine, doesn't mean that that's the most effective way to reach them. So you need to consider that as one of several options when you talk about your go-to-market plan. Your targeting plan, you might consider the short-term plan, long-term plan, how the market will evolve. You got to pick who's going to fit with your strategy, your brand, your product characteristic, relative to competitors. I think oftentimes your average marketer focuses on product characteristics and how it fits today. But the people who are really great strategic thinkers consider how it fits in terms of their overall brand portfolio, their overall customer portfolio, where are they strong today and where can they be strong in the future. You also have to consider which segment is attractive, their size, are they growing, will they be easy to defend. So your positioning plan is all about hitting that target. You picked a target, now you got to hit it. So how are you going to reach that target segment? What are some ideas? Be creative. Come up with a good plan that would be able to reach them. Are they B2B, B2C? Where would they buy? How does the decision-making process happen? Think carefully. Not all the information you need is in the case. Some of it is in your brain. It's in your intuition. So, add value. And how are you going to maximize adoption? Think about diffusion and how people, word of mouth, how visible things are. That could go into your marketing plan. You have to customize traditional plans for adoption to your particular segment. And you might not be able to do a great job at this stage in the class, but hopefully if you redid your assignment by the end of the class when we cover innovation, you'd really be able to come up with some good ideas that would maximize diffusion within your target segment. Long term, you got to consider your sustainable competitive advantage. What wrinkles and systems and networks and things can you build into place that will make it kind of sticky and hard for competitors to come up from behind and steal your customers. And then think about your defense plan up front. Right now you're trying to attack, you're trying to win, you're trying to gain market share in a new emerging market. But eventually you're going to be confronted with defensive issues and you have to win upgrades and repurchases of next generations. And where will the next generations take you and also take your target segment? If you can kind of think far in advance and at least be aware of what might happen, you'll be better situated to make changes and adapt your plan. The last thing I'll say is to really be a great strategic thinker, you need to always be aware of the assumptions that are behind any analysis. Of course, I love analysis. I'm a PhD, very into it, but everything has an assumption in how your data was generated. And then for all your strategies, you need to be conscientious of the risks that underlie any choice. And you're making a probabilistic choice, and that requires good judgment. And people that get lucky a lot over time, they probably have good judgment. There's multiple options that Apple could have took when they launched the iPhone. Hopefully they were thinking about these type of long-term issues up front. And it looks like they were based on their success and some of the things they did. But also, Steve Jobs and all the other people a part of his team, they had good judgment. They understood there were risks and they were comfortable with the risks and they tested their risks. So you want to think of how could you add some more research, some experiments, some whatever to really go to market and go to market in a big and bold way, but in a way that constantly allows you to learn and update and adjust to anything that's changing as you actually go to market. Okay, that's the end of this presentation, the end of this help session, the end of this online class. I hope it was very helpful to you. I plan on doing one on conjoint analysis for marketing engineering, so look for that. And I'll also do one on choice modeling, at least I plan to. So those will be online as well at some point in the future. And hopefully they'll be effective resources to you as you move on into the future at your jobs. I want to provide them online for free and have them live online so that you can come back to them.
We got to give the people